Emily Watson took a deep breath as she stood outside the massive courthouse doors. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone steps, and she could hear the distant hum of traffic from the busy London streets. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her worn leather briefcase, the same one her father had given her when she graduated from law school. Today was different from all the other cases she had handled. Today, she was facing one of the richest men in Britain, and the whole country would be watching. Emily had spent weeks preparing for this moment, reading every document, interviewing every witness, and practicing her arguments until she could recite them in her sleep. She pushed open the heavy doors and walked into the grand hallway. The courthouse was buzzing with activity. Reporters with their cameras and notebooks crowded near the entrance to the main courtroom. Emily recognized some of them from television. They were all here because of James Morrison, the tech billionaire who had made headlines for buying struggling companies and supposedly destroying thousands of jobs. Emily's mind drifted back to her childhood home in Manchester. She remembered the small terraced house where she grew up, with its tiny kitchen and cramped living room. Her father, Tom Watson, had worked at the local textile mill for 23 years. He was a quiet man who took pride in his work and never missed a day, even when he was sick. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. The mill owners announced they were closing down, just like that. Her father and hundreds of other workers were told their services were no longer needed. Emily would never forget the look on her father's face when he came home that day. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in her life, she saw her strong father cry. The months that followed were the hardest of Emily's childhood. Her mother took on extra cleaning jobs to make ends meet. They had to sell their car and cancel family holidays. Emily watched her parents argue about money late into the night, thinking she was asleep. The stress aged them both, and her father never quite recovered his confidence. That experience shaped everything Emily believed about justice and fairness. She had worked harder than anyone else in law school, studying while her classmates were out having fun. She took on student loans that would take years to pay back, all because she was determined to fight for people like her father. Now, as she walked toward the courtroom, Emily felt the weight of that responsibility. She was representing 15 workers who had lost their jobs when Morrison bought their factory. These were real people with real families, just like hers had been all those years ago. The courtroom was packed. Emily had never seen so many people crammed into one space. The workers she was representing sat in the front rows with their families. She recognized Mrs. Sarah Collins, a woman in her 50s who had worked as a seamstress for 18 years. Next to her sat David Miller, a father of 3 young children who had been a machine operator since he left school. On the other side of the room, James Morrison sat with his team of expensive lawyers. Emily had seen his picture in newspapers and magazines countless times, but seeing him in person was different. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair and sharp eyes. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Emily earned in a month. The media had painted Morrison as a cold, calculating businessman who cared only about profits. They called him the corporate shark who destroyed traditional industries without thinking about the human cost. Emily had read every article about him, and they all told the same story of a ruthless man who would do anything to increase his wealth. As the judge entered the courtroom, everyone stood up. Judge Margaret Phillips was known for being fair but tough. She had a reputation for not being impressed by wealth or status, which gave Emily some comfort. "Your Honor," Emily began when it was her turn to speak. "Today, we stand for the forgotten workers, the men and women who build these companies with their bare hands, only to be cast aside when it became convenient. Her voice was steady. Even though her heart was beating so fast she was sure everyone could hear it, she had practiced these words so many times, but saying them in front of all these people felt different. Emily looked directly at Morrison, expecting to see the cold, indifferent expression she had imagined. She wanted him to know that she was not intimidated by his wealth or power, but what she saw surprised her. Morrison was not looking bored or dismissive. Instead, he was listening carefully, taking notes on a yellow pad. For just a moment, doubt crept into Emily's mind. Something about his expression was not what she had expected. But she pushed that feeling away. She had a job to do, and she would not let these workers down. As Emily continued her opening statement, she felt the weight of every story she was carrying. These were not just legal cases to her. They were real people with real families who needed someone to fight for them. The battle had begun, and Emily was ready for war. Emily stood up from her seat, her hands steady now as she held her first piece of evidence. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, and she was ready to show everyone exactly what kind of man James Morrison really was. The courtroom was silent except for the soft scratching of reporters' pens and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. "Your Honor," Emily said, her voice clear and strong, "I would like to present evidence of the sudden and unexpected layoffs that occurred just 3 weeks after Mr. Morrison's company took control of Millfield Manufacturing." She walked to the evidence table and picked up a stack of termination letters. Each one told the same story of workers who had been given less than 24 hours' notice that their jobs were ending. Emily had read each letter so many times that she could recite them from memory. Double quotes. "Mrs. Sarah Collins received this letter on a Friday afternoon," Emily continued, holding up one of the documents. "After 18 years of loyal service, she was told her position was being eliminated immediately. No warning, no consultation, no consideration for years of dedication." Emily looked round the courtroom, making eye contact with the workers she was representing. She could see the pain in their faces as they relived those terrible days, when their worlds had been turned upside down. David Miller, a father of 3 young children, was told the same thing. Emily went on. He had worked at that factory since he was 18 years old. It was the only job he had ever known, and suddenly it was gone. She presented more evidence, showing how the workers had been promised their jobs would be safe during the company transition. There were emails and recorded phone calls where Morrison's representatives had assured the employees that nothing would change. Emily had spent weeks gathering all of this proof, and she was confident it painted a clear picture of broken promises and corporate greed. "These are not just numbers on a balance sheet," Emily said, her voice growing more passionate. "These are real people with real families who trusted the promises they were given. They believed they were safe, and that trust was betrayed." Emily expected Morrison's lawyers to stand up and object, or to present the usual corporate defense about difficult business decisions and market forces. She had prepared for every argument they might make. She was ready for them to claim that the layoffs were necessary for the company's survival, or that the workers should have seen the changes coming. But something completely unexpected happened. James Morrison himself stood up from his seat at the defendant's table. His expensive lawyers looked surprised, and Emily could hear whispers from the crowd behind her. "Your Honor," Morrison said in a calm, respectful voice, "may I address Miss Watson's concerns directly?" Judge Phillips looked puzzled but nodded approval. Emily stared at Morrison in shock. In all her years of practicing law, she had never seen a wealthy defendant choose to speak for himself instead of hiding behind his legal team. Most rich businessmen paid their lawyers millions of pounds precisely so they would never have to face their accusers directly. Morrison walked to the center of the courtroom, and Emily noticed that he moved with quiet confidence but without arrogance. He looked at her directly, and his expression was serious but not hostile. "Ms. Watson," Morrison began, "I want to start by saying that I understand your client's frustration, and I want you to know that their concerns are completely valid. What happened to them was not acceptable, and they have every right to be angry." Emily felt her confidence fall slightly. This was not what she had expected at all. Morrison was not denying the accusations or making excuses. Instead, he was acknowledging that her clients had been wronged. However, Morrison continued, "I would like to clarify some facts about the acquisition that I believe are important for everyone to understand." What happened next shocked Emily so completely that she almost forgot where she was. Morrison did not just read from prepared notes or repeat rehearsed statements. Instead, he began speaking with detailed knowledge about employment law, workers' rights, and the specific legal requirements for company acquisitions. He referenced cases that Emily herself had studied in law school. He quoted employment regulations that she had planned to use in her own arguments. But most surprising of all, he did it with what seemed like genuine compassion and understanding. Under the Employment Rights Act of 1996, Morrison said, "Workers are entitled to proper consultation before any major changes to their employment. I want to be clear that this did not happen in the way it should have, and that failure is something I take full responsibility for." Emily listened in amazement as Morrison continued to speak. He knew about redundancy procedures, about the legal requirements for notice periods, and about the rights of long-term employees. This was not the kind of knowledge that most business owners bothered to learn. They usually left such details to their lawyers and human resources departments. "The truth is," Morrison said, looking directly at Emily and then at the workers in the courtroom, "I have been studying labor law for the past 5 years. Specifically because I wanted to ensure that business decisions do not destroy lives the way they once destroyed my own family's." Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Morrison's last words had hit her like a physical blow. He was talking about his own family being destroyed by business decisions. Just like hers had been, this was not the heartless corporate monster she had expected to face. As the first day of the trial ended, Emily packed her papers with shaking hands. She realized that she might have seriously underestimated her opponent. But more importantly, she began to wonder if she had completely misjudged him. The man she had prepared to battle might not be her enemy after all. Emily could not sleep that night after the first day in court. She lay in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what had happened. James Morrison's words kept playing in her mind like a broken record. He had said that business decisions had once destroyed his own family, just like they had destroyed hers. How could that be possible when he was now one of the richest men in the country? The next morning, Emily arrived at her office earlier than usual. She made herself a cup of strong coffee and sat down at her computer. Something was bothering her about Morrison, and she needed to understand what she was really dealing with. She had always believed that knowledge was power, and right now she felt like she was missing important pieces of the puzzle. Emily began searching through old newspaper articles and business journals. She wanted to find out more about Morrison's background and his business practices. At first, she found the usual stories about his success and wealth. But as she dug deeper, she started discovering things that surprised her. There were small articles buried in local newspapers about scholarship programs that Morrison had quietly funded. These were not the big, flashy charity events that rich people usually supported to get their names in the papers. Instead, these were small, practical programs that helped students from poor families pay for university. Students just like Emily had been. She found records of legal aid clinics that Morrison's companies had supported in working-class neighborhoods. These clinics provided free legal help to people who could not afford lawyers. Emily had used services like these herself when she was starting out and could barely pay her rent. The more Emily researched, the more confused she became. This did not match the picture of Morrison that she had created in her mind. The media had painted him as a ruthless businessman who only cared about money. But the evidence she was finding told a different story. On Wednesday afternoon, Emily decided to visit some of Morrison's former employees. She wanted to hear their stories directly, not just read about them in court documents. Her first stop was the home of Margaret Thompson, a woman who had worked for Morrison's first company before he became famous. Margaret lived in a small house in a quiet neighborhood that reminded Emily of her own childhood home. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair. She invited Emily in for tea and seemed genuinely pleased to have someone to talk to. "I read in the newspaper that you are fighting Mr. Morrison in court," Margaret said as she poured the tea. "I suppose you think he is a terrible man." Emily nodded, expecting to hear another story of corporate cruelty and broken promises. But what Margaret told her next completely changed everything. "You have got it all wrong about Mr. Morrison," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "My husband Robert was dying of cancer 3 years ago. The treatments were very expensive, and our insurance would not cover all of it. We were going to lose our house trying to pay the medical bills." Margaret paused to wipe her eyes. With a tissue, Emily sat quietly, sensing that this was an important story that needed to be heard. "One day, Mr. Morrison called me into his office," Margaret continued. "I thought I was going to be fired because I had been taking so much time off to care for Robert, but instead, he told me that he had spoken to the insurance company personally. He made sure that everything was covered, every treatment, every medication, everything." Emily felt her throat tighten as she listened. This was not the story she had expected to hear. "When Robert passed away 6 months later, I thought that would be the end of it," Margaret went on. "But Mr. Morrison came to the funeral. He did not make a big show of it. He just came quietly to pay his respects, and then, a few weeks later, he helped my son get into university. He paid for everything: books, housing, tuition. All of it." Emily felt her entire worldview shifting. She had built her case, her career, and her beliefs on the assumption that people like Morrison were the enemy. Rich people who had forgotten where they came from and did not care about ordinary workers. But Margaret's story suggested something completely different. That evening, Emily found herself working late in the law library, trying to make sense of everything she had learned. The library was quiet and peaceful, with tall windows that looked out onto the city lights. She was surrounded by law books and case files, but her mind was far from legal arguments. She was so lost in thought that she did not notice someone approaching until she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Miss Watson," the voice said. "May I have a word?" Emily turned round and saw James Morrison standing in the doorway. He was not wearing his expensive court suit. Instead, he had on simple jeans and a sweater, and he looked tired. For a moment, Emily was too surprised to speak. "I hope you do not mind me coming here," Morrison said. "I asked around and someone told me you often worked late in this library." Emily nodded, still not sure what to expect. Morrison walked closer and sat down in the chair across from her desk. "I want you to know that I agree with much of what you said in court," Morrison began, his voice quiet and sincere. "Those workers did deserve better treatment during the company transition. I made mistakes, and I want to make them right. For the first time since the trial began, Emily really looked at Morrison, not as the wealthy businessman she had expected to fight, but as a person. She saw someone who, like her, seemed to carry the weight of other people's problems. Someone who understood what it meant to struggle. "Why did you not say this from the beginning?" Emily asked. Morrison smiled sadly, and Emily saw something in his expression that she recognized from her own mirror. It was the look of someone who had grown up poor and never quite forgotten what that felt like, because sometimes people need to see who you really are, not just hear what you say. Morrison replied, and sometimes the best way to fix things is to work together. Emily woke up early on Thursday morning with a strange feeling in her stomach. It was not the nervous excitement she had felt on the first day of the trial. Instead, it was something she had never experienced before in a courtroom. For the first time in her career, she was not sure if she wanted to win or lose her case. She sat at her small kitchen table, drinking coffee and thinking about her conversation with Morrison the night before. Everything she thought she knew about this case had changed, but she still had 15 workers counting on her to fight for them. These were real people with real problems, and they needed more than just kind words and good intentions. Emily arrived at the courthouse to find reporters everywhere, just like on the first day. But now their questions were different. Instead of asking how she planned to destroy Morrison, they wanted to know if it was true that she and Morrison had been seen talking together in the law lib. "Really, Miss Watson, are you planning to settle this case?" one reporter shouted. "Is it true that Morrison offered you money to drop the lawsuit?" called another. Emily pushed through the crowd without answering. She knew that anything she said would be twisted and turned into headlines that had nothing to do with the truth. Right now, she needed to focus on her clients and what was best for them. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt completely different. The angry tension that had filled the room on the first day was gone. Instead, there was a sense of possibility, as if something important was about to happen. Emily looked across at Morrison, who gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. When Judge Phillips called the court to order, Emily stood up with a different kind of confidence than she had felt before. She was no longer preparing for a battle. Instead, she was preparing to find solutions. "Your Honor," Emily began, "before we continue with the formal proceedings, I would like to address Mr. Morrison directly about his offer to work together to find solutions for my clients." The judge looked surprised but nodded for Emily to continue. The reporters in the back of the room leaned forward, sensing that something unusual was happening. "Mr. Morrison," Emily said, turning to face him, "if you truly want to make things right, then let us talk about real solutions, not just good intentions. These workers need more than promises. They need concrete help that will allow them to rebuild their lives." Morrison stood up and walked to the center of the courtroom. Emily could see that he was carrying a folder full of papers, and she wondered what he had prepared. "Ms. Watson, you are absolutely right," Morrison said. "Good intentions are not enough. Let me show you what I have in mind." What happened next was unlike anything the courtroom had ever seen before. Instead of standing on opposite sides and arguing, Emily and Morrison began working together like partners. They pulled their chairs closer together and spread Morrison's papers on the table between them. "Let us go through each worker's situation individually," Morrison suggested. "I want to understand exactly what each person needs, and then we can figure out how to provide it." Emily opened her own files and began reading the details of each case. This was not just about money or legal settlements anymore. This was about real people with real lives that needed to be rebuilt. "Mrs. Davies has been with the company for 15 years," Emily said, pointing to one of her files. "She is 55. years old and very worried about finding new work. Most companies do not want to hire someone her age, even though she has incredible experience. Morrison nodded thoughtfully and made notes on his paper. Then let us create a pathway for her. He replied, we can offer her a position in our new training department, teaching the skills she has developed over those 15 years to the next generation of workers. Emily looked at Morrison with surprise. This was not a standard corporate response. Most companies would offer a severance package and consider their responsibility finished. But Morrison was talking about creating actual jobs and opportunities. They continued working through each case. David Miller, the father of 3, was offered not just a new job, but also additional training that would help him advance his career. Robert Jackson, who was close to retirement, was given a pension package that would allow him to retire with dignity. As they worked, Emily began to realize that something beautiful was happening. They were not just solving legal problems or settling a lawsuit. They were creating real solutions that would help real people rebuild their lives and move forward with hope. Judge Phillips watched in amazement as the two opposing sides became partners in finding justice. She had been a judge for 20 years, but she had never seen anything like this before. Usually, court cases ended with winners and losers, but this looked like it might end with everyone winning. The reporters in the back of the room were frantically taking notes. They had come expecting a dramatic courtroom battle, but instead they were witnessing something far more powerful. They were seeing two people from completely different worlds finding common ground in their shared humanity. By Friday afternoon, Emily and Morrison had worked out detailed plans for all 15 workers. Some would get new jobs. Others would receive training for better careers, and all would get health care coverage and financial support during their transition. Emily looked at Morrison with new respect and understanding. She realized that sometimes the greatest victories do not come from defeating your opponent in battle. Sometimes they come from discovering that the person you thought was your enemy was never your enemy at all. 6 months had passed since Emily Watson first walked into that grand courtroom, her heart pounding with nervous energy and her mind filled with thoughts of battle. Now, as she stood in the exact same spot, everything felt completely different. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows just like it had before, but Emily was no longer the same person who had entered this room ready for a war. The courtroom was packed once again. But this time the atmosphere was filled with excitement and hope rather than tension and anger. Emily looked out at the crowd and saw familiar faces from her original case. But now they were smiling. Mrs. Davies sat in the front row, wearing a smart business suit that she had never owned when she was worried about losing her job. David Miller was there with his wife and 3 children, all of them looking proud and happy. Emily adjusted her jacket and took a deep breath. She was about to make an announcement that would change everything. Not just for the 15 workers she had originally represented, but for thousands of workers across the country who might face similar situations in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, Emily began, her voice clear and confident. 6 months ago, I stood in this same courtroom believing that I was here to fight a battle between the powerful and the powerless. O'Day, I'm here to announce something that I never thought possible when this journey began. She paused and looked across the room at James Morrison, who was sitting at what used to be the defendant's table. He was no longer her opponent. Instead, he had become her partner in creating something that neither of them could have achieved alone. Today marks not just the end of a legal case, but the beginning of a movement. Emily continued. James Morrison and I are here to announce the establishment of the Workers' Transition Foundation, a legal organization dedicated to protecting employees during corporate changes and helping them rebuild their careers with dignity and hope. The crowd erupted in applause. Emily could see reporters in the back taking pictures and scribbling notes, but she was not worried about what they would write. The story was telling itself, and it was a story of hope rather than conflict. Morrison stood up and walked to join Emily at the front of the courtroom 6 months ago. Emily would never have imagined standing side by side with him, working toward the same goal. Ms. Watson taught me something very important during our time together, Morrison said, addressing the crowd. She taught me that good intentions are not enough. Real change requires listening to the people who are most affected by our decisions and working with them to create better outcomes, not just for businesses, but for the human beings whose lives depend on those businesses. Emily felt a warmth in her chest as she listened to Morrison speak. She remembered how angry she had been when she first met him, how certain she was that he represented everything wrong with the business world. Now she understood that her anger had been based on assumptions rather than facts. The Workers' Transition Foundation had already begun making a real difference. In just 6 months, they had helped over 300 workers across the country who were facing job losses due to company changes. Instead of just fighting these changes in court, the foundation worked with both employees and employers to find solutions that protected workers while still allowing businesses to grow and adapt. Mrs. Davies had become one of the foundation's greatest success stories. Instead of struggling to find a new job at 55, she was now running Morrison's new worker education program, teaching younger employees the skills and knowledge she had gained over her 15 years of experience. She earned more money than she ever had in her previous job, and more importantly, she felt valued and respected. David Miller had used the foundation's retraining program to learn new technical skills. He now worked for a different company in a better position, earning enough money to provide for his family and even save for his children's education. Other workers had received support to start their own small businesses, turning their years of experience into successful independent careers. Emily looked out into the crowd and saw her father, Tom Watson, sitting near the back of the courtroom. He had traveled all the way from Manchester to be here for this announcement, and Emily could see tears in his eyes. She knew he was thinking about his own experience at the textile mill all those years ago, and how different things might have been if something like the Workers' Transition Foundation had existed then. After the official ceremony ended, Morrison approached Emily as the crowd began to leave. The reporters were trying to get their attention, but both Emily and Morrison ignored them for the moment. "Thank you," Morrison said quietly, so only Emily could hear. "You reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. I had forgotten that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of other people's suffering." Emily smiled, thinking about how completely wrong her first impressions of Morrison had been. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the best way to fight for justice is not to fight at all, but to work together." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Emily reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had entered this building 6 months ago as a fighter, ready for a battle, convinced that the world was divided into heroes and villains. She was leaving as a bridge builder, understanding that real change comes through cooperation and understanding, rather than conflict. The lesson was clear to her now. Real strength does not come from tearing other people down, but from lifting each other up. And sometimes the person you think is your greatest enemy might just become your most powerful ally in the fight for justice and fairness. The end.